So Jonathan Ashworth was the man who lost his seat of Leicester South to the independent candidate Adam Shockett over the fact that he abstained on his position for the first Gaza ceasefire vote. Now, he is now the head of Labour Together, a right-wing Labour think tank that helped plot Keir Starmer's rise to power. I've got plenty of content that you can have a look into on that specifically if you want to know more about them. Either way, he's been appointed, having lost his seat, to be head of this think tank. Real jobs for the boys on this one. And because essentially nobody else would be wheeled out by the Labour Party to defend their decision to suspend the whip from 7 Labour MPs for voting for an SNP amendment to the King's Speech to get rid of the 2-child benefit cap, he had been roped into LBC to cover for James O'Brien during their guest host week, whilst James O'Brien is on holiday. And I thought, I know that the Labour Party have got an indefensible record on what's going on with regards to the suspension of MPs for voting for the SNP motion. And I think that Jonathan Ashworth isn't a particularly erudite chap. So I will call in. I have previously got form for calling in to high-profile Labour people and humiliating them on LBC, like I have previously done with Rachel Reeves, link in the description. So let's see how I took Jonathan Ashworth to task over the suspension of Labour MPs. Let's listen.
I think we're now going to go to Helena in Nottingham, who has a different view of this. Helen, you think it was an overreach. Is that right, Helena?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when Boris Johnson removed the whip from people who didn't vote for his Brexit deal, it was rightfully decried by centrists and liberals as being sort of scandalous in how he was trying to corral MPs around his specific vision. And of course, they had their own particular viewpoint on these particular issues. And I believe this is exactly the same. When you all rightly point out he has a giant majority, this was never going to pass as an amendment, it shouldn't matter then. Then, of course, whether or not these MPs do or don't vote with the government is not having any utility in terms of whether the bills pass. Blair knew this. Blair, when he was in power, people voted against him all the time on plenty of issues because they had consciences. And he realised that party unity was far more important to him than performatively flagellating anybody to the left of Gerhard Schroeder in terms of how they're dealing with policy.
Performatively flagellating. Did you vote Labour in the election, Helena?
I mean, it is performative flagellation, that's true. I think it's interesting as well that he knows. I think he noticed immediately by signalling out the performative flagellation comment. I think that he knows that I am referring to factionalism here from the Labour right in control of the party, wanting to humiliate the left specifically. I think he knows that that's what I mean by that.
No, who would you sort of support? Did you was it Green or something like that?
Yes, I voted for the Green Party. I left the Labour Party 18 months ago because I believe the platform that was put forward was not the one that was put forward in the leadership election when Keir Starmer decided to get elected, because of course, his platform that he put forward was something that was based upon Labour Together's polling internally of Labour Party members, and then was immediately turned heel on, essentially after the Hartlepool by-election, when he decided to change tack and become far more right-wing in terms of his platform. And I thought that was a betrayal of what the mandate that he was given by the Labour membership. And so I joined the Green Party, and I have a positive platform and a democratic platform internally within the party that supports what I believe to be policy and its best utility.
And what do you make of the argument?
It's a reasonable statement for me to make. I mean, I don't want to be a party with people like you, Jonathan, and so I've left and I've joined another better party, which I think was quite funny, just openly to his face saying, people like you drove me out of the party and I won't vote for you.
That the Keir Starmer leadership would come back at you on, which is we've just been elected 3 weeks ago. We put forward a manifesto. The King's Speech essentially is that manifesto, and Labour MPs have a duty to support it and not vote with the opposition MPs in order to undermine it.
I mean, actively not removing the 2-child benefit cap wasn't in the manifesto. What was in the manifesto was a goal to get the highest sustained growth in the G7. Yes. That was a central mission of the Labour government. Just 2.5% growth, as is being essentially one of the kind of high growth targets that Keir Starmer's put forward, would lead to an extra 47 billion in the coffers each year. That's 2.5%. That's your goal that you've said you're going to hit. And that is way more than you would need, first of all, to fill the £20 billion gap in terms of public sector in terms of public services, or the IFS had identified as being public conspiracy of silence during the election campaign. And then on top of that, you'd also have enough money to remove the 2-child benefit gap. That'd be plenty of money to plenty of things.
But isn't the issue here? I mean, I'm on record.
Which is true. Again, like, if you're saying, oh, well, we can't commit to it because we don't think we can afford it, well, then, if you don't get the highest sustained growth in the G7, then you've also failed your promise to the British people. If you can promise that you're going to get the highest sustained growth in the G7 as your central mission, that means you can promise to use the proceeds of that to do good things as well. They'd already made the point in this very discussion on LBC that the King's Speech itself is about the programme for the next couple of years or so. If it's voted on the King's Speech, it doesn't immediately become policy. You have to find the money for it now. even in terms of the household budget, in like one in, one out nonsense with regards to how we talk about taxation policy and macro finance in this country. Even outside of that, that wouldn't preclude you from having it in the King's Speech, because a commitment to removing it in the King's Speech would be something that would be absolutely fine. Would be absolutely fine to be able to do, given what they've promised to be able to do. So it makes no sense to say, oh, we can't put in the King's Speech at all, even though it wasn't even in the manifesto, to not do it.
Court describing the two-child benefit cap as two-child benefit limit as vicious and heinous. And one of my big motivations, one of my driving reasons that I was in elected politics was to tackle child poverty. I was very proud, for example, to have worked for
Was in elected politics. Ayo!
Gordon Brown for many years, who lifted 1 million children out of poverty. But the government did announce this week a child poverty task force. It was actually a policy I announced back in the day when I was the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary. That child poverty task force will look at all of these issues. And I suppose the Keir Starmer government would say, give us a bit of time, engage with the task force, we're looking at all these issues in the round, but don't vote with opposition MPs in Parliament to undermine a Labour King's Speech. Do you not buy that argument?
Well, I don't see why we need to engage in all of this this continual expenditure on quangos and inshallah to try and find solutions to these things over time, when we already have plenty of data from think tanks, from charity, the Child Poverty Action Group, for example, that the two-child benefit cap being removed would immediately lift 300,000 children out of poverty. And as I said, it's not even that much. What, £3 billion? That's chicken feed in terms of the amount of money we spend. It's the same amount of money that we're sending in terms of our funding for Ukraine, for example. There is plenty of ability, essentially, in terms of how you could change public finances to do this as well. Of course, we have a productivity crisis in this economy, and that's because we don't tax unproductive income the same we tax productive income. So not only if we, for example, if Labour had a promise, for example, to equalise capital gains tax with income tax, not only would that raise more than, quadruple the amount it would to remove the two-child benefit and immediately lift 300,000 children out of poverty, it would also incentivise productive work over unproductive work, which we're currently incentivising with a tax system that doesn't make sense. That could have been a Labour promise going into the election, but again, this is the kind of thing that made me leave the party, because you're not taking sensible decisions in terms of taxation policy, and you're not taking sensible decisions in terms of welfare policy, essentially, because I think, as far as I can see, because you actually genuinely did want to virtue signal towards people in the public who support the two-child benefit cap because of this perceived idea that it might be incentivising people to have kids they can't afford, when the Child Poverty Action Group specifically also said that this policy hasn't even led to a disfertility effect. It doesn't even do what it says on the tin.
Well, on that final point, I can just say that somebody who was part of the team for a while, that this was an issue of what can be funded and what can be costed in a manifesto. It wasn't about trying to signal to people who have that particular view. It was a view that...
And this is where I screwed up. I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have said that it was about trying to appeal to people who want to keep the cap for their own reasons. I shouldn't have said that, to be fair. That was a bad argument, because I knew he would say this in response. As soon as he said it, I was like, oh, I've made a mistake here, because this is where this particular discussion ends. They cut me off after this. But what I should really have said in response here, it's not performative. I mean, I think it is partly performative to signal to people who don't want the children after the second to have extra welfare payments for them. But I also think that it is about trying to be performatively fiscally constrained. And I'm like, well, this is nonsense, right? I've already blown your fiscal constraints argument out of the water, because you're already promising with other policy to be able to increase treasury revenue through economic growth. And if you fail on that, then you failed your promise to the people regardless. And on top of that, there are plenty of fiscal reasons to do it. It is not, indeed, fiscally prudent to not spend this money to take these children out of poverty, because every single second these kids stay in poverty, that means more spending on health and social care, more spending on education, more spending on the crime and justice system, because poverty is correlated with extra crime. Every study will tell you this. And of course, that will need extra spending on social services, for example, to deal with the problems, the negative externalities that poverty creates. Every single second you spend and every single penny that you save whilst you keep these children in poverty is 2 pennies that you have to spend later on dealing with all of those negative externalities. It is fiscal profligacy to not spend money now, to not spend money later. And these are the people who continually bang on about sticking plaster politics and only short-term policymaking. This is explicit short-term policymaking. You get a short-term political win, firstly, for terms of looking fiscally prudent, even though it isn't. And second of all, this optical win by, as I said, performatively flagellating the left of the party. Like, it's been mentioned before, and I'll mention it again. Basically, one of the reasons why Jeremy Corbyn won the leadership election in 2015 is because the Labour right decided to screw over Andy Burnham by not briefing him before Harriet Harman essentially said live on TV that they were going to abstain on the introduction of the two-child benefit cap. And that moment where Andy Burnham kind of had to turn tail and support Harriet Harman on this one essentially led to the point where people in the party who were absolutely gobsmacked that the party had abstained on the two-child benefit cap at its first point of being entered into law, all turned and said, well, no, we want to go for the only candidate who's actually opposing this shit, which was Jeremy Corbyn. And ever since then, the Labour right have been absolutely seething about the fact that they let the Labour left have a bite of the cherry. They let the Labour left have a bite of the cherry. And Harriet Harman was making the same arguments in 2015 that they're all making now, saying, oh, we lost the election. Have you not seen? We don't want to be seen as the party of welfare. That's exactly what they were doing then. And it's partly what they're doing now. And alongside this performative way in which they're trying to make themselves look fiscally prudent, even though it is fiscal profligacy that they're actually engaging in. Because part of smart finances is understanding what you have to spend money on now that you would have to spend more money on later. And this is exactly what the problems that this creates. So there were definitely some things that I should have said to Jonathan Ashworth that I didn't. If I'd have had more time, I definitely would have responded to what he said there about, well, we can't promise it if we can't afford it. Well, then you can't promise to get 1 million houses. You can't promise to get higher sustained growth in the G7, because both of these things are going to be useful for more tax receipts to be able to, under your own framework, fund this policy that you say you won't fund unless you know where the money's coming from. Even though, even under a Keynesian framework, you could justify deficit spending because it's money you'd have to spend later on and is also a pro-growth policy. And on top of that, under an MMT framework, we don't need to use taxes to fund government spending regardless. There are plenty of ways that you could do this. Like, none of his arguments stack up. It's interesting, like, there's a reason why they didn't send out anybody to defend this, and they had an ex-MP, now person who leads a think tank, nobody actually related to the legislative body of the Labour Party, out to defend this, because they know that they can't defend it. It makes them look bad. It makes them look bad publicly, rather than us discussing the lovely Labour win. All that we can see now is just the spite of the Labour right. Their 9-year-old spite being played out live for all of the cameras. And so I think this discussion here with Jonathan Ashworth clearly shows that their arguments don't hold water, although again I wish I'd made a different point on the last one. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description, and if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for memberships. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.